Good afternoon. I hope you had a good lunch and ready for this afternoon session. I think the morning panels gave us a lot of fodder for thought. I found it personally to be very stimulating, starting with the keynote and then the interactive panel session. And I think we have an eclectic panel that will match that. And the panel this afternoon is more from a university or a group here. And it's more focused on education. So in the morning, we got a sense of the challenges and the problems and how, especially the CNN talk, when they talked about going after outcomes and services at one level are really, drilling deeper and trying to find out what outcomes our customers are trying to achieve and getting them to realize that. So this afternoon, we have a group of faculty members plus a representative from industry, Salesforce.com. We're going to give each of the panelists about 7 to 10 minutes to present, and then like in the morning, we're going to have a final Q&A that brings it all together. So let's welcome our panelists. We'll start with Professor Sriram Dasu from University of Southern California, Marshall School of Business.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I'm doing. My background is actually I'm a mechanical engineer, then PhD in operations management also from MIT. And bulk of my work actually is optimization, quantitative stuff. So a couple of years back I decided, maybe 6-7 years ago, I felt that there's an opportunity actually to bring in the soft side of consumer behavior into the processes. So what I have is a very engineering take on what people think is psychology. And so, so it's taken us about a good long time, about 7-8 years, and we have a book. This is bulk of the work I'm going to talk about is co-authored book with Dick Chase, who's done quite a lot of work in services. Okay, so. All right. This is. I think you. Version. Okay, center that. All right. So one way of thinking about this is that you have this basic T structure, and you can think of service marketing as people who communicate what we're supposed to do, and operations is about delivering it. And as the discussion in the morning, we had this thing about this, what is it that we are actually consuming, and so this is backwards. This is all right. So the idea here is that if you think about what we consume as consumers, there are really two components to it. One is the core task. That's what is it that for example, why are we here? What is it that we want to accomplish? And then there's an experience that surrounds it. And we've become really good at delivering the core task. I think that's been the focus of industry engineering and operations research, etc. And the psychology that surrounds it is clearly very valuable. And Gilmore and Pines have this book called The Experience Economy, and they basically argue that if you think about what we're talking about, service economies, it's really not just the core task, but how well is it done, what's the experience, so on and so forth. So clearly the experience matters. And there's lots of data. McKinsey has done surveys, lots of data to show that this is what drives it. But then, the science of how do you deliver the experience, I think, is in somewhat nascent stage. Why is this important? There are two basic reasons why it's important. One is, technology is mediating a lot of the interactions. So in the past, the idea was if you want to deliver great service, it always comes through culture, it comes from the people you hire, and they're the soft skills, right? But if bulk of the interactions are technology mediated, then we have to make this more of a science. Whether it comes through the web, Siri, call centers, so on and so forth. And the other reason is basically if you take large corporations, like if you take, for example, MGM Grand, they have 10,000 employees. You take a hospital, 7,000 employees. So there aren't enough emotionally intelligent people, or people who are performing the core task don't think it's their responsibility or it's their job to be emotionally caring. Right? Actually, I do a lot of work in healthcare. I've had doctors who tell me that I save lives, I don't need to hug my patient. And so, given this kind of issue, how do we go about doing this? And the argument here is that there are a handful of variables that more or less shape our experiences. And for example, if you take financial services, in addition to the core task, as we saw in the morning presentation, trust plays a big role. If I'm going to seek advice from a financial advisor, it's basically about managing trust for me. Right? Similarly, if you think about healthcare, if you think about the psychological dimension, there's trust, there's anxiety, so on and so forth. And we can keep adding to this list. Most of the stuff here is about trust, likability, emotions, so on and so forth. So there are a handful of variables that we can think as shaping our psychological component of the experience. And so we kind of argue, based on this type of evidence, that there are a handful of variables that go towards shaping the psychological aspect of what we are consuming. And these are the variables. These are emotions, level of trust, degree of control, sequence or flow of events, duration, so on and so forth. Right? And so the idea that the argument that we're trying to build here is that these can actually be engineered. In other words, you can deconstruct the concept of trust, and then you can actually look at the interaction and figure out when trust is being built and what are the mechanics by which trust is being built. So here I'm going to only talk a little bit about emotions, and I'll tell you how we can actually engineer emotions into an experience. So let's take, for example, emotions. So this is my premise that IE has converted the art of manufacturing into, it's gone from being a craft to a science. That's the way, that's the basis of the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, I think if we can take science to the psychological side, we're going to gain a lot of productivity in addition to being good at delivering this. So the main take here is that can we design processes to also deliver the implicit outputs? Okay. So that is not just the explicit outputs like the core task, can we design the soft side as well? So I'm going to begin with the emotions component of it. So why do emotions matter? Basically, there's a very nice experiment, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, that shows that emotional memories are different from so-called cognitive memories. And this is an experiment that was conducted several years ago by accident, in which this doctor had a patient who had a brain damage. She did not have any short-term memory. So in other words, you could meet her, 5 minutes later she won't recall who you are. So one day what he did is he took a pin and he pricked her hand with it when he shook her hand. When he came back to the room, she would not shake his hand, but she couldn't recognize him. So that's when they discovered that these two systems are different. So in other words, when you have an emotional event, you remember the emotion, but you may or may not remember what happened. So later on, you might say that you liked something or did not like something, but you may not be able to explain why you liked it or did not like it. And the other thing is that emotional moments are more likely to be recalled. They're more likely to be coded more strongly into the memory. And there's a lot of literature to show that emotions influence our decision making, so on and so forth. What's the point here? The point here is that if you're looking at engineering the experience, the emotions that people bring in or the emotions that you're going to influence to the service delivery are extremely important. Because they're going to influence recall, they're going to shape what you perceived, so on and so forth. In fact, there's a ton of work on emotions, about how decision making is influenced by emotions, so on and so forth. So what does this mean to us who are delivering services? So this is what I just said. Here's an example of what I mean. Emotional events are more easily recalled. This is a picture, and this kind of, if you think about what this is conveying, it's conveying an emotion. It's such a powerful image, and it's easily recalled. Right? So decisions, anger influences confidence, anxiety influences risk taking, right? And hope influences. Okay, so going back to this, so emotions is such a soft concept, how can we engineer it, right? But in fact, actually emotions are, although it's a soft concept, it's pretty easy to predict emotions in different stages of the process. There are only, there are a handful of factors that determine which influence you feel. In other words, one is change in goal distance. If you think something is going to happen and something worse is going to happen, you're going to experience negative emotions. How important is the goal? The more important the goal, the stronger the emotion. How certain is the outcome? That determines whether you're feeling anxious or threatened. And who's the source of change? If you are responsible for it, you might feel regret. If someone else is responsible for it, you might feel anger. So the point is that these four drivers, and you can very easily see that these four drivers are very nicely linked to process flows. So if I want to start mapping process flows, I can actually predict the emotions that you'll experience. So there's a close connection between the drivers of emotions and what you might feel at different points. So here is an example to illustrate that idea. So if you think about, what happens to a patient, this is a hypothetical situation, somebody who discovers his car is not working, and you map out the process flow, you could also probably map out what he or she might be feeling at different points in the experience. Okay, so this is, in short, there's a close correspondence between what emotions people feel and what the transaction flows are. So here is another example. If you take a longer process, like for example, the pregnancy cycle, you could actually map out different points in the pregnancy cycle where, where the emotions are high, the kind of emotions you're going to experience, so on and so forth. So what does this mean? It means that there's a very close correspondence between the process flows and the feelings that people experience. Because there's a close correspondence, when you have large data sets, you can actually mine them out. You can either figure it out through transaction history, or you can figure it out based on what is the service that you're delivering, and you can segment them out. Or alternatively, you can actually monitor the process on a real-time basis and figure out their emotions. So I'm going to stop here. Actually, the reason I sound a little bit my flow is not consistent with my slides because there's an older version of the deck. And I sent in a deck yesterday and that wasn't loaded, so I sort of prepared to talk the other deck, and so this flow is off. So I'm not going to use my deck here, and we're just going to summarize very quickly. The point here is that there are a handful of variables that shape how we experience a service. And there's a ton of work that's been done in behavioral sciences, ranging from cognitive sciences to consumer behavior, so on and so forth, that actually speak to us about how trust is formed, for example. When do we want control? When don't we want control? What's the nature of control we seek? Right? How do we form judgments of trust? How do we feel? The nice thing about this literature is there's a beautiful correspondence between what they consider important in terms of determining these feelings and process flows. And as a result, there's a huge opportunity to using data to actually understand when people feel a sense of control, when do they lose control. What feelings do they experience at different points in time? How are they forming judgments of trust? And once we are, we are able to make the link from the process flows to the psychological variables, there is an opportunity to design services with the same level of rigor with which we have designed the explicit outcomes. You can do that for the implicit outcomes also. So that's the basic thing. And so I think if you think about where we are going with technology mediation, I see this as being a very valuable way of thinking about services. I'm going to stop with that.